poor Mort. Thought for sure he was gonna make captain. Got into Ray's bodyguard and everything. Yeah, he said he was gonna marry that girl from the drunken pick once we got done here too. Which girl? You know, the one with the... Winston made roundish gestures with his hands, then glanced at Lady Zaradnik and stopped. Ah, the girl with the red curls. Tita. What? She said she was gonna marry me. Wait, she told me that too. That bitch. Joachim glanced at the faces of the men standing around the campfire. A few were from the Baroness bodyguard, but most had wandered over with the captain of the company camping nearby, whom Lady Zaradnik had invited over to answer some questions she had about her paperwork. Gossip about the owlbear encounter had by then circulated around the camp, however, so the topic inevitably drifted to questions about the fight. So, how do you outdo that Ray? I'd rather you not frame it in that sense, Captain Ceres, Lady Zaradnik replied. It lends to the belief that the general is somehow deficient as a commander. Then how do you put it, milady? The risks to each group were different, the Baroness told him, as was how we approached those risks. The general's bodyguard had the composition of a standard imperial patrol, meaning that they only had one cleric. Priest Bennett was strong enough to take on one of those owlbears by himself, but he was tied up supporting the rest of his squad. I took advantage of the owlbear's single-minded rage and their poor climbing skills, ordering Destin to fight his opponent from a tree. The rest of my squad was able to take down the other one at their leisure with 2 clerics on hand. Also, if you absolutely had to make a point of it, the comparison between commanders would be between myself and the sergeant leading General Ray's bodyguard. You're saying that the general didn't matter there? Rather than him not mattering, it's a difference in role. How long have you served as a captain for? The old captain retired about 3 months before we were deployed here, Captain Ceres replied. I was a sergeant for 3 months before that. Joined the 6th when the legions got shuffled around. It was an unusually rapid series of promotions. Joachim did not know the man well, but he at least knew Captain Ceres was not an academy graduate. He must have either enlisted as an already exceptional individual or displayed exceptional growth while displaying traits that the army deemed desirable for an officer. That being said, the Imperial Army's captains were all knighted, so one had to wonder what he had done since the spring when all the 6th Legion did was conduct exercises in that time. Have you ever trained directly against a commander? Lady Zaradnik asked. No, milady, Captain Ceres answered. It's always been against other captains or sergeants. Commanders usually only do stuff when there's multiple companies under them. Why do you think that is? Just the way things are, I guess, the captain shrugged. Commanders just do bigger things, generals even bigger. I suppose that is how it seems, the Baroness said. The actual explanation falls under somewhat similar lines. Sergeants and captains lead smaller groups of soldiers from the front, while commanders and generals lead larger groups from the rear. Our skills and abilities as officers reflect those roles. The effect of a sergeant or captain is more direct and we have a strong influence over our squads or companies. Commanders and generals have broad effects that influence much larger groups of soldiers but are less effective with smaller groups than captains. It would be impossible to do so from a general's usual position on the battlefield, anyway, so it can't be seen as a deficiency on their part. But even commanders got a start from somewhere, Captain Ceres noted. I didn't just forget what I did as a sergeant because I made captain. Doubt that'd happen if I made commander, either. It won't, Lady Zaradnik agreed. But General Ray didn't follow the same path as rank-and-file soldiers. He's a noble that went to the Imperial Magic Academy and then moved on to the Imperial Military Academy. He focused entirely on his career as a commander with generalship as the eventual goal. To be honest, I believe his approach to be superior for that particular path. Most of the Army's generals were captains before they became commanders, milady. They do just fine. They do, Lady Zaradnik nodded. But consider the case of General Carbane. Like General Ray, he has little in the way of personal martial valor, but he is still considered the Empire's best general and the 2nd Legion is considered the most effective army group. Captain Ceres furrowed his brow, jaw working back and forth as he mulled over the Baroness' words. So you're saying that, if I wanted to make general, I shouldn't have worked so hard at making captain? The path you've taken does make for a more tactically flexible commander and I think it is sufficient within the Empire's borders. Out here, however, You are in a far more competitive and unforgiving environment, so you'll need all the advantages that you can get. Also, there is nothing inherently wrong with being a captain. But everyone aims up, milady. Commanders and generals get more than captains. This is an organizational and administrative issue, Captain Ceres, Lady Zaradnik said. In Baharuth and Reistais, civilization has developed in such a way that what is deemed important differs vastly from how other places might see things. The mechanisms through which resources are secured and distributed run on certain assumptions that crumble if put to the test. The greatest recognition goes to those who influence the greatest number of people in times of peace. In these wilderness tribes, it is usually the exact opposite. That's 'cause they're savages, milady. Civilized folk have rules. Rules are established to uphold order, the Baroness replied. But order must be sustainable in the first place. If a monster came and attacked the Empire, which rules could the citizens point out to it that would save them? None, milady. The army'd have to come kill it. Or maybe adventurers if it was powerful enough. So whose rules is the Empire ultimately playing by? For that matter, these savages in the wilderness have their own rules, but a goblin pointing them out to your company won't stop you, will he? Captain Ceres fell silent, staring quietly at the fire. The answer was clear enough. There are rules and there are rules, Captain. The rules you speak of are what the Empire employs to regulate the behavior of those who answer to Imperial authority. The rules that I speak of are the realities of the world that the Empire holds no authority over and must also answer to. Imperial citizens are accustomed to the former, but, as a member of the 6th Legion, you will find yourself facing the latter. As you do what you must to succeed out here, you may find the way that Imperial citizens recognize things at home becoming increasingly lopsided. That's a demoralizing picture you're painting there, milady. Only if you're dissatisfied with what you receive for your achievements. As a captain, you can still become a baron and continue to earn honors that help you develop your new territory. I believe almost any of you would be more than happy with that. One of the main issues that I see is that accepting a promotion to commander as an experienced captain places you in a practically inferior position. Your company is robbed of your leadership and the division that you are placed over would do much better under a commander like General Ray. You're a captain like me, Captain Ceres said. Would you honestly turn down a promotion to commander or general? It's not something I have to worry about, Lady Zaradnik replied, but I would turn down a promotion to a different role if I was. It's not what I am, and the administration of the Sorceress Kingdom measures its citizens according to the roles that they occupy regardless. In my domain, a farmer is expected to operate a farm, but the fact that they answer to the local management doesn't make them lower in terms of the respect that they are afforded. Similarly, a noble is simply a noble, and I hold no illusions over whether a farmer is better at certain things than I am. Simply put, people do what they're good at and there is no shame in what they do. In fact, vocational excellence is a major point of prestige. Then how does that work for the army? My involvement in the army comes with obligations as a vassal, so you could say that I simply am. When the point comes that we require a formalized structure for citizens that join the army, it would probably be similar to knighthoods in the Empire. Ranks would be honorary rather than the definition of one's role. As to what they would be called, perhaps they would be graded for simplicity's sake like our adventurer guild. Did that mean these citizen soldiers would advance like adventurers? Everyone seemed to compare themselves in strength to adventurers of different ranks anyway, so adopting the same progression felt like it would be relatively painless. At any rate, Lady Zaradnik said. Thank you for answering my questions about these after-action reports, Captain Ceres. I should fill them out while events are still fresh. The men around the fire bobbed their heads respectfully before leaving amidst the general cheer of the encampment. Joachim frowned at the festive atmosphere that had spread over the outpost as the men of the battalion celebrated their good fortune. You wouldn't think that a man had just died, he muttered. There's no way that they don't know, Lady Zaradnik said from the desk placed under the tent's veranda. But at the same time, it is a risk that they all accepted with their assignment to the 6th Legion. Besides, as the scion of a border house, I can't imagine that your nights will be filled with weeping over losses in battle. I can't see it as the same, my lady, Joachim replied. Meeting one's death in honored service is something that their friends and family can be proud of, but this army group's mandate is less about honored service and more mercenary. Given that the man was handpicked for the general's bodyguard, All I can think is that his ambition cost him his life. Is there something wrong with that? Of course. As long as one is alive, there is always the future and the opportunities that come with it. The 6th Legion is full of men who considered their future and decided that it wasn't enough. To live life is to take risks. He turned to look down at Lady Zaradnik, who was too busy filling reports to look up. She had for some reason switched from tying back her hair in a ponytail to forming it into a loose chignon, using her blue crystal pin to hold it in place. The exquisite ornament glistened in the magical lighting overhead as she focused on her work. Their fight with the owlbears was probably the most notable thing that had happened in the battalion's campaign thus far. It was certainly the one that the least people were involved in, and its sole fatality was the first honorable death in the 6th Legion. To the victors also went the spoils, 4 owlbear corpses, 1 of unusual size, and 8 owlbear eggs. The eggs alone were worth 200 gold trade coins each to collectors and trainers of exotic magical beasts. Several of the more knowledgeable people present in the outpost estimated that the corpses altogether would be at least another 100. All told, that was 3,400 gold in imperial coinage. To put it another way, if split evenly between the men, each would earn from that brief battle more than what it cost an entire family to live in our winter for a month. To all but the wealthiest merchants and nobles, it was a lot. That was not how things would be distributed in practice, of course. A third of the gains went to the 6th Legion's rolling pool of campaign rewards, another third went towards equalization payments with the army at large, and the remaining third stayed in the battalion. The battalion would also try to make payments fair using a similar structure, with a third being kept by the battalion's command for special operational expenses and broad awards, a third split between the entire battalion, and the remaining third being awarded to the parties directly responsible for the gains. Lady Zaradnik abstained from partaking in any awards, which in turn had General Ray abstaining as well. In short, this meant that the 26 remaining soldiers of the 2 bodyguards would receive 14.5 imperial gold coins each. It was an astonishing windfall for commoners, roughly a year's salary for the lowest pay grade in the army, and the rest of the battalion would still receive the equivalent of an expensive night in Orenstead. As if she could see his frown through the back of her head, Lady Zaradnik spoke. A promise is being fulfilled, Priest Ward. A promise, my lady? They are not simply celebrating the gains made today, she said, but the fact that what drew them to the 6th Legion is indeed true. A promise is being fulfilled, and they are celebrating the promise that it holds for the future. Joachim peered into the darkness at the men gathered in front of their tents. The sounds from the surroundings abruptly ceased. He looked back down to find Lady Zaradnik looking up at him. At her hand on the desk was one of the magic items that she carried around with her, one that produced a silence effect in a shell around the item. Was there something you wished to say? The Baroness asked. Don't you think it's greedy? At what point is ambition greed? I mean no offense by saying so, my lady, Joachim said, but you are at least 10 times more pious than the average imperial citizen. Which also means you're twice as pious as me. While you and I do not share the same faith, there should at least be some commonalities when it comes to righteous living. In this case, I am referring to ideals of service, honor, charity, frugal living, and the reining in of rampant greed. Our standards are not precisely the same, Lady Zaradnik said, but I understand what you're trying to say. Because I am as pious as you describe, or maybe more so, I often examine such things, comparing where I see boundaries compared to others and what is truly right and proper. And what is the answer you've arrived at thus far? It depends. Joachim snorted. You'll forgive me if I say that your answer is rather unexpected of an adherent of Sursana. Judgment and justice are not served by arbitrary arbiters, Priest Ward. While my judgment is far from perfect, I still strive to be even-handed in all things. You accompanied me the other day as I went around asking the men about their aspirations. Could any of them be considered greedy? No, but I believe that the means by which those aspirations are achieved can lead to the development of unhealthy appetites. It is a story told time and again. That is a rather unexpected assessment for a citizen of a country that extols the virtues of meritocracy. If all men are to be weighed according to their own merits, should their actions not also be examined on a case-by-case basis? And how much damage would that cause in the process, my lady? The officers of the Imperial Army are but mere mortals. Examining every case is an impossible task and justice is by nature reactive. By mitigating such behavior, risks to the innocent and general degradation in morals can be reduced. Who defines risk? Lady Zaradnik asked. To what extent must behavior be mitigated? As a cleric in the Empire, you should well understand that the interests of those in authority may not fall in line with your beliefs. The influence of the temples is deemed a risk by the imperial administration, and problematic behaviors by the temples and their clergy have been mitigated for generations. Would you so readily do the same to others? I am of the mind that if the Empire wasn't so insistent on painting the temples as a rival for political influence, the Empire would be far better off than it currently is. The mandate of the temples is inherently selfless. We look out for the well-being of all. Lady Zaradnik frowned, giving him a long look. Joachim swallowed. What? Do you earnestly believe that? It seems plainly obvious to me, my lady. It is obviously not the case, Priest Ward. If the temples of the Four looked out for the well-being of all, you would have been protesting the systemic aggression not only against the tribes of this wilderness but all of the populations that have been displaced or exterminated to facilitate the growth and development of the Baharuth Empire. This isn't something you've confronted General Ray about, my lady. I haven't yet, Lady Zaradnik said. But it is something that the Empire will have to face at some point. What I said to Captain Ceres was not solely to do with personal advancement. The Empire, too, must see beyond the illusory walls it has built around itself and determine what its true place in the world will be. I still find it ridiculous that a tribe camped right on top of an owlbear den. Demi-human stupidity should only go so far. You've never seen something like that before, I take it, Your Excellency? Are you implying that this wasn't some dumb stroke of bad luck, my lady? That's right, Lady Zaradnik replied. Migratory tribes may purposely overwinter near dens where monsters and magical beasts are hibernating. It's a trap, of sorts, or perhaps a deterrent. Ray leaned back in his seat, reaching out to pull a cup of steaming tea to his lips. Though spring would officially begin in 2 weeks, it was colder in the valley than it was during the depths of winter in the lowlands. Their southwards advance made it seem like the seasons were running in reverse. Whenever they held meetings in his pavilion, the Baroness would bring along one of her magic items to heat the space and make things more comfortable. What is the logic behind this deterrent? He asked. The idea is fairly straightforward, the Baroness answered. Certain creatures aren't active during the winter. The caves and other dwellings that these creatures may occupy have long been known to the tribes living here for countless generations. If something comes to attack the camp, the defending tribe rudely wakes up the den's occupant and leads it straight to the intruder. Suddenly, the would-be attacker has a grouchy bear on their hands. Or a grouchy owlbear, in our case. But the tribe had already vacated before we arrived, Ray noted. It's close enough to spring that they would already be considering vacating the area anyway. Coincidence or forewarning from our activities is just as likely the culprit. What doesn't change is that the den's occupants would still be there, about to wake up and very hungry. Turning the camp inside out for loot would have triggered the trap. The day after the owlbear encounter, Ray had his battalion continue small-scale operations from their outpost while he adjusted his plans to account for the new risks and the changing situation that his advance discovered. His mobile headquarters now had a company present at all times to deal with unexpected powerful threats. As they were now at their third outpost, he was down to 6 companies. 1 was required to defend the camp and 2 were resting, meaning that the forces available for conducting operations were down by a third of his expectations due to the altered arrangements. Compounding the problems that came with the change was the fact that the wilderness became increasingly hospitable, making resistance more substantial. Aerial reconnaissance had identified at least double the number of demi-human tribes in the vicinity of the third outpost compared to the second. Despite this, his battalion's motivation only increased, especially with the windfall discovered in the wake of the owlbear attack. An aide came forward to update the campaign map with fresh reports from the Dragoon flights. Nothing dire had been noted, there was simply more. The light raids we've been conducting will take more time than anticipated to push all these demi-humans back, he said. To reach the southwestern pass before the 4th and 5th Division, we'll have to increase the pressure. If we had those Death Series servitors, we'd have already linked up and would be well on our way to consolidating our position. Do you still consider your current strategy optimal, Your Excellency? Ray looked up from the map to where Lady Zaradnik was standing along the side of the table to his right. The Sorceress Kingdom's liaison officer had earned some renown amongst the battalion due to the attack of 2 days previous, but she made no overt moves to take advantage of the fact. Not that she needed to. The image that she had created for herself was a self-perpetuating one that required minimal effort. Now that he had seen enough of her, Ray recognized very well what she was doing and what she was. The true form of the Sorceress Kingdom's liaison officer was a goddess of victory, a female officer akin to those who occasionally appeared in the Imperial Army, rapidly rising to join the ranks of the Imperial Guard. It didn't matter that she was from Riestais, all she needed was a bit of training, the unmistakable good looks of a noble and mannerisms of a martial aristocrat to begin the process of wrapping the soldiers of the Imperial Army around her little finger. Given how advanced the Sorceress Kingdom was, she didn't even need to be strong. Their magic equipment could probably turn a maid into a monster. All she needed to do was nudge the people around her in the desired direction and let their regard for her do the rest. If she kept winning, that was great. If she lost, the men would be sensitive to her vulnerability, rising in her defense or seeing chances to get closer to her. Any turn of events could be turned to her advantage with sufficient interpersonal skills, and the men fell over themselves whenever she relied on them for one thing or another. The question for Ray was his response to how she was playing the games of power and influence. However, it was a difficult question to answer as the Baroness gave no indication of what she wanted. She only spoke of herself when prompted, only doing what seemed to be the bare minimum of framing her personal position. Otherwise, she simply watched, asked questions, and any requests that she made were for the purpose of finding out more about the battalion and its operations. The men in her makeshift squad swore that she kept relationships friendly, but not too friendly. Given the current information and assumptions, yes, Ray replied. Was there something that you noticed, my lady? Around the pavilion, aides and officers stole surreptitious glances towards the table at his uncharacteristic concession. Ray resisted the urge to snort at their astonishment. He supposed that, to them, General Ray was a man that never relinquished his grip on the reins of power once he got a hold of them. Asking what he did was as good as admitting that he was deficient in some way, creating an opening through which to attack his position of authority and influence. But he was a man that did what was necessary to get what he wanted. It was not the Empire that he needed to impress, but the Sorceress Kingdom. If he could connect with their representative, it would make things easier, but his attempts thus far felt like he was scaling a vertical wall made out of smooth ice. It's more a question that concerns the rationale behind your operations, Lady Zaradnik said. Broadly speaking, the 6th Legion has its so-called expeditionary mandate, but Imperial foreign policy's only aggressive point is its former stance on Riestais. The mandate of the 6th Legion represents a new arm of the Imperial Army that is not covered by the Empire's foreign policy despite being expeditionary. I see, Ray nodded slowly. I believe the answer to your question can be found in the fact that a nation's stance towards unclaimed territory lies in their domestic policy, as counterintuitive as that may seem. There are both defensive and offensive aspects to it, but humanity's situation has always leaned heavily on the defensive side of things until recently. Our approach reflects the slogan that I'm sure you've seen on every third government poster plastered in the cities and towns. Rich country, strong army. Indeed, Ray placed his hand on the table while gesturing with the other. Prosperity and strength are the focus of the Empire's national strategy. Prosperity is derived from industrial development, strength from magical might and martial discipline. If you look through our history, you'll see how the foundations of our success have been laid. The 6th Legion's work inherits that intrepid spirit that tames the wilds and turns it to productive use. The slogan was easy to spout but difficult to make a reality, speaking volumes of the excellence of the imperial administration and its institutions. It was an act of national will whose sheer magnitude was probably lost on a girl who had gone from the backwards Riestais to the stupendously powerful Sorcerer's Kingdom overnight. So what happens when there is no room to expand? Lady Zaradnik asked. A century or two from now, when all of its lands are as developed as the Wyvernmark, as prosperous as the Golden Strand, and every imperial city is as the Winter of today, what will the Empire do? Assuming everything else stays the same, which I doubt, the Beastman Kingdom to the south is the most likely source of conflict. They incessantly raid the Draconic Kingdom for food and sport, and I do not think their stance towards the Empire will be any different once we settle this wilderness. The only answer to such savage aggression is war. Have you considered the idea that the Beastman kingdom you are referring to is far stronger than the Empire? I've some acquaintances who have witnessed their raids firsthand, and to be frank, they'll probably find the Imperial Army just as edible as the Draconic Kingdom's security forces and far more entertaining. The combat capability of the average adult Beastman far exceeds that of the average adult human. It was commonly said that if the average adult human was difficulty rating 3, the average adult Beastman would be difficulty rating 30. This idea, however, was misleading in a few ways. First was that the difference between difficulty ratings was not multiplicative. A difficulty rating 30 individual was not 10 times stronger than a difficulty rating 3 individual. Many factors went into how such a contest would play out, but if one compared difficulty rating 3 humans to difficulty rating 31s, the difficulty rating 3 human could get lucky and kill the difficulty rating 30 human with an arrow to some vital area. Similarly, one could take 4 farmers and arm them with pikes to fend off an Imperial Knight, which was essentially what Reasties did en masse. Another misconception was that, since the average adult Beastman had 10 times the difficulty rating as a human in that example, it meant that a human growing in strength to difficulty rating 6 would mean that a Beastman experiencing similar growth would be difficulty rating 60. The reality was that they would be difficulty rating 33, and that particularly strong Beastmen were just as rare as particularly strong humans. Beyond that, Imperial Knights were not average adult humans. Veteran Imperial Knights were roughly difficulty rating 30, and the hard-won experiences of the 6th Legion would inevitably produce fighting men of even greater quality. They would not have issues matching Beastmen on the field. By developing its internal and external frontiers, Ray said, the Baharuth Empire by that time will have 3 times the territory that it has today. The Imperial Army will not only have 3 times the numbers, but we will also have the benefit of the technological and magical advancements made between now and then. It goes without saying that the undead forces of the Sorceress Kingdom will have been fully integrated, so these demi-humans will break themselves on our defenses and provide us with just cause to go on the offensive. Which is something you're attempting to emulate here.
Yes,
my lady. Within the bounds laid out for our operation, I consider it the optimal strategy. The entire Imperial Army cannot compare to the Death Series servitors, but the current batch of least undead are restricted to defense. Thus, we will have them defend. Not only will it save time, but it will also spare the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers who would otherwise be lost in the time it takes to expand our borders and secure everything. There was absolutely no downside to his plan, and he was sure that the Sorceress Kingdom had issued their approval of the 6th Legion's campaign in the south. Understanding this, the Empire would claim new territory that it would be able to easily defend with Death Series servitors. With the land secured, development would proceed apace, and everything that came with that development would follow. The Empire would gain in wealth and power, and the Sorceress Kingdom's influence would expand. Settling the southern wilderness dangled a tantalizing target in front of the Beastman Kingdom, and, once the war that ensued was won, they would have a gateway to the world beyond. It was a win in every direction and set the stage for future expansion, all under the pretense of eliminating hostile threats. With the Sorceress Kingdom's expanding influence would come the efforts of the world to keep it in check. At that juncture, world domination under a defensive pretext was not inconceivable. As usual, Lady Zaradnik did not display any reaction to his words beyond lending to the impression that she was intently listening. Was she oblivious to the significance of what he was saying? Perhaps it was another way in which the Baroness' apparent passiveness manifested. I hesitate to ask, my lady, but have you done something like this before?
What do you mean by that?
Justifying retaliatory action due to an attack on your border, for instance. Or leading your enemies into friendly areas where they could be decisively dealt with. It has happened before,
yes.
If that was the case, he was almost certainly on the right track. The stubborn fools who opposed his actions would be proven unsuited to lead those who would forge the destiny of the Baharuth Empire. If efficiency is the goal, Lady Zaradnik said, have you considered more benign methods of expansion? The unexpected question gave Ray pause. I beg your pardon, my lady? Promoting trade with local tribal populations, for instance. The exchange of culture and ideas. You could have them become political allies or even join the Empire as citizens. By doing so, You would minimize bloodshed for all involved, and many previously unknown avenues might be opened to you. No matter how he thought about it, he could discern no long-term merits to her suggestion. The tribes were primitive and nomadic, with nothing that could not be outstripped by imperial skill and ingenuity. Slavery might be an option, but all they would be good for was menial labor, if they could even manage that, and entertainment in the arena. Maybe they could be exported to Carnassus, but the sheer abundance of them would eventually see most end up as food. There was no incentive for merchants or anyone else to do anything else with the tribes here. It would be more efficient to employ human settlers to develop these lands, Ray told her. Incorporating the demi-humans as you suggest would require us to somehow familiarize them with our systems, and I would pity the administrator that has to do their paperwork for them. Instead of taking a century to harness the potential of these lands, it would take millennia. Considering the intelligence of the average goblin, even that is a doubtful prospect. Just going by what your reconnaissance efforts have mapped of this valley so far, Lady Saradnik motioned at the table, human development would only make use of perhaps 30% of the land, mostly in the low and relatively level areas following the river. Moving into this wilderness without settling on some sort of peace with the local tribes will result in the Empire defending every valley from their encroachment for generations to come. That is a reality that the Imperial Army is well accustomed to, and our security doctrines are suited for that scenario. Another legion will be raised to provide security for this new region of the Empire, and any defensive conflict will serve to strengthen the solidarity of its citizens, not to mention bring the least forces from the Sorceress Kingdom into play. If the Baroness had anything further to say, it remained unspoken as Captain Ceres entered the pavilion. He gave a respectful nod to her as he made his way in front of Ray. "The 6th, 7th and 8th companies are all ready to go, sir," he said after a sharp salute. "We await your presence." "Excellent," Ray nodded as he rose from his seat, turning to address Baroness Saradnik. "We have a long day ahead of us." "After you, my lady." Was it willful callousness or an unbelievable state of systemic blindness? Time and exposure to the citizens of the Empire brought Ludmilla no closer to a long-term solution for their one-sided perspective of the world. Rather than reaching out to work hand in hand with the Imperial Army and bringing awareness to possibilities that they had previously been unaware of, Ludmilla felt like she was conducting a one-woman siege of a fortress constructed out of their worldviews. Or rather than a siege of a fortress, something stood between herself and everyone else when it came to specific things. They saw her, spoke with her, even admired her, but it was as if some malevolent force actively worked to keep her from striking at the heart of the matter. It was worse than her words going into one ear and out the other. They were received and waylaid by a vast array of rationalizations and ignorance, overridden by imperial worldviews, or simply received with politeness and discarded out of view as irrelevant. Half of the time, she thought that they didn't even recognize what she was saying. She did her best to understand not just the motivations of the Empire and the Imperial Army, but also those of its officer corps and as much of the rank and file that she had time to speak to. Yet developing an understanding of them brought her no closer to her goal. The only things that mattered to them were the approaches and solutions that they saw as valid. All else was dross. Regardless of background, education or training, they were products of a society that had long drifted from many truths of the world. By all indications, Riestais was much the same, but the divergence was even stronger in the Empire. No, that wasn't correct. Both had diverged under the same starting conditions, but the Empire was the more successful of the two states. That success worked to continually reinforce their problematic perceptions. It was the tragic irony of the Great Seeding, or perhaps it was the true damage of the heresy of the Four. Creating a geopolitically safe nation in the hopes that it would one day become a bastion of humanity had instead resulted in the progressively weak and misguided states of Riestais and Baharuth. In the west was a country incapable of upholding order and by all reports was due for some sort of catastrophe. In the east was a country building proud glass towers on illusory foundations. The tenets of her faith, which conveyed the truths of the world as they were relevant to humanity, had been replaced by a heresy that did nothing to correct the self-indulgent whims of both. From what she had seen of the temples in the Empire, they were an institution that only existed to uphold the status quo. Even when they ministered to their own faithful, it felt woefully shallow. Its standards and measures felt ineffectual because they never addressed the important aspects of life beyond misguided temperance and arbitrary human niceties. Ludmilla gave her head a shake, taking a deep breath as she guided her horse along. Being judgmental would get her nowhere, and her friends went around to provide elegant solutions that they would probably derive at a cursory glance. All she had were her rigid and clunky ways of doing things, ways that depended on mutual understanding, willing cooperation or brute force. Compared to Riestais, the Empire was in a far better position. This was not only because it was more secure and stable, but it had created institutions that could effectively spread the ideas and attitudes that those in power wished to spread. In short, they were more easily taught. She imagined that if the Empire had eventually taken over Riestais, Riestais's leadership and population would be reshaped within a few generations. The Empire's success with its institutions was what drove Ludmilla to thoroughly study them, as she wished to emulate that success in the Sorceress Kingdom. It was what also dangled the highly attractive possibility that, if she could sow the seeds of change with the 6th Legion, the entire Empire would eventually follow suit. To that end, she could be as patient as she needed to be.
"Milady," Igval called out to her, "that a monster den?"
"No, you dumbass," Destin replied for her, "that's just a broken boulder." The men of her bodyguard laughed. Igval seemed to take it in good humor and continued peering at every bush and boulder they passed. Between the denser concentration of potential threats and the fact that there was now a full company forming his mobile headquarters, General Ray's energy went more towards the command of his forces than acting as her guide. He even brought his men into combat where possible in an effort to make up for the loss of flexibility that came with the changes to his operations. With this being the case, Ludmilla spent more time quietly observing the battalion than discussing matters with the general. Her squad followed her around as she went back and forth taking note of everything that she could. The owlbear encounter of 2 days previous had heightened the alertness of the men, though it was more than being alert for potential windfalls than dangerous threats. The atmosphere that it created was positive in certain ways and worrisome in others. "Whatever comes, comes, don't go out of your way to find trouble." The men returned to her and tightened their ranks. "If you want them to stay out of trouble, my lady," Joachim Ward said, "we should return to the center of the formation." Upon hearing the cleric, the men turned pleading gazes toward her. Ludmilla glowered at their expressions. "Whose hungry hatchlings are you?" She already knew the answer to that. Ray's battalion had been groomed to be ambitious and she had fed them once. Much like wild animals, they hoped for more. They had passed quite a number of valuable things, but she hadn't pointed them out for fear that they would start stopping to uproot every bush and boulder in their path. There was nothing inherently wrong with possessing ambition, and it was natural to desire the improvement of one's situation. The problem was the Empire's idea of what improvement was, the imbalances that it caused and what might inevitably happen to correct those imbalances. Except with the protection of the Sorceress Kingdom, the Empire could become a blight upon the world. This was a future headache that could be preemptively avoided. Prime Minister Albedo's carefully constructed scenario created a place where the Empire could be made aware of the problems that Ludmilla had identified, but, so far, the nice or perhaps soft approaches were ineffective. She needed to make things relevant somehow, to have them recognize what she was showing them. Pushing too hard was unacceptable, as the royal court did not want the Sorceress Kingdom's answer, but the Empire's. To provide an appropriate answer, however, the Empire required a baseline of knowledge that it seemed to lack, or at least discount to the point of being irrelevant. It was an increasingly frustrating loop of apparent futility. When it came to her ability to measure how people aligned with His Majesty's will, Imperial citizens were a bit worse than the human residents of Eranthal, which was not so terrible that she felt compelled to enact corrective measures. They also fluctuated just as frequently. Even General Ray was no exception, so she could only continue to poke them lightly, hoping for a favorable response at some point. "We'll continue working the outskirts," Ludmilla replied. "General Ray is focusing on his duties. It would be improper for me to distract him from them now that we're in more dangerous territory. The tribes don't seem much tougher than when we started, milady." "The tribes are strong enough as they are," she replied. "You've been seeing relatively effortless success so far because not only are you striking tribes unprepared for an attack, but you are overwhelming them before they can muster effective retaliation. Once you lose that momentum, the situation will change." "That makes us sound like demi-humans." At the mention of demi-humans, several of the men slowed their steps and glanced around. Ludmilla smiled slightly. "If you plan on serving in an expeditionary force," she said, "it would be for the best if you re-examine the concepts that you've brought with you from civilization." "What does that mean, milady?
In the Empire, Ludmilla replied, demi-human is more idea than reality, a creature that comes in a variety of forms that adds spice to tales. It does credit to the Imperial Army's security efforts that the vast majority of the Empire has never seen one before, but it also distances its citizens from the reality of what they are. Out here, you cannot allow a label to become the entirety of your threat assessment. I still don't get it. We've fought plenty of Demos now, they're every bit the dirty savages that I thought they were. That's because you only see what you want to see, Ludmilla said. The results of your actions thus far make it so that it is unnecessary to think otherwise. You may believe that you enjoy a superior position to these demi-humans for now, but humans are not a strong race in the grand scheme of things. You will eventually reach a point where your momentum will carry you straight into a wall that you are oblivious to because the ideas that you cling to are blinding you to the truth. I can only pray that you will survive that experience. Attempting to put forward the idea that other races might be less savage or alien than they thought didn't work because the ideas already entrenched in their minds made other races irreconcilable with humanity. A more involved process seemed to be in order, such as chipping away at those ideas through topics immediately relevant to her men's tasks. Hopefully, enough cracks would form for her to squeeze into or even bring the whole fortress of societal constructs crumbling down. When you think of demi-humans, Ludmilla said, which race first comes to mind? Goblins. Why? I guess 'cause we see 'em the most. What comes to mind when you think of goblins? The smell. Low chuckles rose around them. Anything else? There's a lot of 'em. They're noisy. Ugly. Fighting 'em is pure chaos. Ludmilla nodded at each of their answers. Every race has its own standards of beauty, she said, so we'll leave the point of their appearance aside. Have you wondered about the reasons as to the rest of what you've observed? Because they're goblins? Because they're social, Ludmilla told them. The smell and noise of goblins can be overwhelming to the senses precisely for that reason. They possess collective behaviors that confuse predators and improve the survival rates of a goblin tribe as a whole. Additionally, if you dropped a monster into a busy market plaza in Karlsheim, how much of that same behavior will you see? Will panic and chaos not erupt? Will people not scream and shout? Who will run? Who will fight? For what reasons might they risk themselves? I'm fairly certain that everyone already knows the answers to these questions. It's not the same, milady. She looked over to her left, where Frank was riding beside her. It's not? Ludmilla asked. Why? Because they're goblins. You're going to have to come up with a better answer than that. They're dangerous. They raid. You also raid, Ludmilla said. You're A's raiders, yes? Do you not believe that what you're doing is dangerous to them? They crossed a churning brook, which filled the air with the sound of its rushing water. Winston spoke once they left the noise behind. We're doing it for a good reason. Demi-humans also have valid reasons, Ludmilla told him. They raid for resources or they raid to enforce their territorial dominance, which is essentially securing resources. Sometimes they migrate and come into conflict with other populations. Has the Empire not effectively been doing the same thing? You run out of land and spares fill the towns and cities. Out of a desire for a better life, some join the army. Your conquests will open new lands and new opportunities to the destitute, facilitating migration. The new legion created for this new frontier will enforce the Empire's territorial dominance while the victorious expeditionary army will continue to carry the torch of imperial progress far and wide. That same torch will be used to set demi-human communities aflame and it will grow brighter and burn more fiercely with every conquest. Eventually, someone will act to extinguish that flame before it comes to burn down what they care for. But they won't be able to, right? We got those undead from the Sorceress Kingdom. The Empire will be safe from that kind of thing. They are for defensive purposes, but the culture of conquest cultivated by generations of imperial expansion will carry the Empire into wars that consume the lives of its citizens as quickly as they are born. If it does not, it will collapse under its own weight. Every generation will see tens of millions sacrificed upon the altar of war. Some will believe that this is a necessary thing, others, not so much. It might even be interpreted as a good thing for those with a vested interest in imperial expansion. What outsiders believe will be contingent on their perspective. Predictably, Joachim Ward was the first to react to the image that she painted for them. How can that be seen as a good thing?
he asked. No nation would willingly pursue such conflicts. Wars of that magnitude would give rise to countless undead who do not care for either side. That didn't stop Baharuth from pursuing its war with Reistais, Ludmilla told him. If anything, the creation of more negative energy zones is a convenience, nearby places where two countries can agree to fight their battles, much like the Katsa Plains, though I suppose how they are created would encourage aggression. It's strange how that works. How so, my lady? Well, if negative energy zones are the product of overwhelming amounts of death and the negative emotions that come with it, then they can be weaponized. If, say, the Empire encounters a defensive position that it finds particularly problematic or identifies a key territory whose loss will result in the economic and industrial collapse of the territories around it, all they need to do is fight there until it becomes so steeped in negative energy that the defenders cannot maintain their position against the resulting undead. Joachim's mouth fell open, aghast at the brutal and indiscriminate tactic that she had suggested. The Empire would never do that. The Empire removes obstacles to expansion and development in the most efficient manner possible. The temples of the Four have no say in the matter. If they create another Katsa Plains at their enemy's expense to gain 10 times the territory, then they will. Then they'll have another Katsa Plains to deal with after the fact. It will have been worth the cost, Ludmilla shrugged. Their newly acquired territories will vastly outproduce the drain in resources since they'll have least Death Series servitors to contain the threats that manifest from those negative energy zones. In the future, they may also possess the capacity to cleanse these zones after they've served their purpose. Furthermore, for most of the Empire, it will be something that happened elsewhere. I still do not believe that we would be so heedless. What is heedless to you may not be to others. No one shares the exact same considerations, but they do share laws and culture that act as chains that both bind their behavior and pull society as a whole in ways that it isn't aware of. It is something that people cannot entirely resist. While individuals might be able to quickly adapt or change their ways, the collective will of society was not so easy to bend. Furthermore, it was a force that dragged its members into line and pulled them off unwillingly and often unknowingly. This was especially the case for the Baharuth Empire, where culture was an instrument used to manipulate the masses into forming and adhering to the mechanisms prescribed by the state. If those mechanisms sent them hurtling towards a cliff, they would not be able to stop even if they knew it was there. They were already in the process of falling off of several and didn't even realize it, convinced that they were instead taking flight. Yeah, but we're just small folk, Merge said. What you're talking about is for the big important people. There's nothing we can do about it. Everyone contributes to the identity of a people in some way, Ludmilla told him, and the chains that bind society tomorrow are forged today. This is of particular importance to the 6th Legion. What you're doing now will set the precedent for the Empire's expeditionary forces and influence its future policies. You will be what comes to mind when the world beyond thinks of the Baharuth Empire, but, so far, what you are doing indicates that you believe that the world is yours to do with as you please. You must have thought a lot about this, milady. I have, but my thoughts are not solely from examining the Baharuth Empire. There is at least one other example of an expeditionary force that I'm well acquainted with. Reistais? Joachim frowned. I don't recall them having any kind of expeditionary force. Reistais does not, Ludmilla said, but the Sorceress Kingdom does. The Adventurer Guild of the Sorceress Kingdom is its expeditionary force. It's ironic, really. The Sorcerer King, who is feared by so many as an evil undead being, reforged an antiquated, nominally defensive organization into an institution that promotes exploration, discovery and diplomatic goodwill. The Empire, on the other hand, reforged the advanced and defensively structured 6th Legion into an instrument of unbridled conquest.